Thomas, how has centering prayer deepened your awareness of the love of God?
Well, please remember that I was converted, you might say, to pursue contemplative prayer when I was about 17, during my first year at Yale University. And so I was reading books about contemplative prayer, and centering prayer as a term didn't exist yet. So whatever progress I had made was based on pursuing the traditional teachings about meditation, especially Lectio Divina, but Lectio Divina not as a separate method, but Lectio Divina leading to resting in God. That is to say, moving beyond the words and the thoughts about the words and the feelings that the thoughts gave rise to from time to time, resting in God, which is my understanding of what Lectio Divina is supposed to do. It's not spiritual reading. It's a specific kind of way of reading that leads into interior silence, and increasingly so that the other acts, how much you read, how much you think and reflect, how much you express your aspirations, becomes briefer, and the silence becomes longer. So that's the whole thrust of centering prayer, is to further the movement into resting in God, interior silence, the end of the interior dialogue, and surrender. So it involves all the faculties, but in a more focused way than discursive meditation and reflecting on what one is reading. It's using those human faculties to move beyond them. And once you have moved beyond them, on certain occasions, obviously there are ups and downs all the time that all of us are familiar with, then the movement towards silence becomes the primary focus. So I had been doing this now for, let's see, from 17 to about 45. So we didn't even think of centering prayer. It didn't even have a name. So when the thought of trying to put this contemplative tradition into a method arose, challenged by the very excellent methods that Eastern spiritual teachers were providing in the West after World War II, and which young people were certainly benefiting from. So the whole thrust of centering prayer is to have a method to do what I just described. The moving through the stages of Lectio Divina as a method into its purpose and where it takes you automatically if you keep doing it, and that is a more direct and silent and peaceful and restful, which may not even be in a particular ministry, but you might say just the presence, the awareness of the presence of God. And that's a movement I think takes place in all the great spiritual practices in Christianity, for instance, the divine office, chanting the Psalms. I mean, after a while, you're not thinking of what the Psalms are saying. You're thinking of the presence to which you are addressing them, or your own miserable condition that needs help of God, and so on, depending on what state you're in at the present time or what your circumstances are. So centering prayer was not even a word that we created. It was suggested by a group of who were just being exposed to the whole process that I had been exposed to and doing for, 20 years? About 20 years. And so I had the context for this thing, and so in trying to develop a method and a teaching background, all of that went into the equation. And so when you ask me how did centering prayer help me, I would say it perhaps focused a little more closely on what I had been doing in Lectio Divina, moving into contemplative prayer or interior silence from time to time. But there is a shift, of course, in centering prayer. It's directly focused on the silence or the presence or the end of the journey without any particular relationship to those preliminary steps that occur in Lectio Divina. And that's important to remember because the resting in silence emerges directly in centering prayer, whereas in Lectio it's based on the refining of a thought or word or phrase from Scripture that simplifies itself in such a way that it slips into this presence rather than continues to reflect or make acts about the effective prayer that might have occurred in the process. So if you're thinking, for instance, of some event in Jesus' life, you don't follow those steps in centering prayer. There's presuppose that you're doing Lectio or have the background that you've developed at another time. Centering prayer is for silence and nothing else. So it's going to be more difficult for a beginner as a rule unless they've had instruction in doctrine from some other source. But the centering prayer itself is a development of Lectio Divina that presupposes it having been done or doing it at another time of the day or sufficient. But Lectio Divina is Lectio Divina if it's only about a single word. Help is Lectio Divina. We think of Lectio as having a book. So the term Lectio needs to be sort of reduced in its importance. It's the movement into silence, of which reading something can be very brief. It can be a whole pericope, but it's never a lot of reading because then you have too many thoughts. But it's a reading that is becoming focused and moving from its expression into its source, which is the mysterious presence of God that is in the depths of our being and waiting to be discovered by us. Lectio is the primary way of doing it. So I was doing centering prayer in that sense, but it had no name. And so centering prayer that is reduced just to the method is not really centering prayer. Centering prayer as contemplative prayer or as moving into that dimension is a reflection on the mysteries of faith that has been digested, you might say, and reflected upon and expressed in acts of love and so on, until it has simplified into a movement of the will that is becoming quasi-permanent and is habitual in prayer itself.
When you speak of Lectio Divina, Father, are you meaning the four movements?
Yes.
To read,
but often
Lectio
is unfortunately taught, even in the catechism of the new catechism, which is in many ways is excellent, but in this way is somewhat deficient because Lectio without moving into contemplative prayer is not the Lectio of tradition. it's a way of occupying the mind in a pious way, whereas contemplative prayer is a way of occupying the mind and transferring it to the heart so that it becomes more heartfulness than mindfulness with practice.
Thomas, when you moved into a more focused prayer, once you realized that you were with centering prayer itself, did you notice any different fruits in your life that took place because of the greater focus of intention that centering prayer
Well,
brought?
I think that's the natural movement of contemplative prayer, so I couldn't tell you whether it was. So I've used the method of centering prayer to enter into, and it's helpful if you have a busy schedule or active mind and are thoroughly distracted. Some means of preparation that we call a vestibule is pretty important or essential. But I think that centering prayer has to be taught with a certain expansiveness, that it really includes any effort at interior silence in the presence of God that evokes more and more of our total surrender to that presence.
And purifies our intention.
And purifies
because
the intention.
that's why you made the point of the method of centering prayer is a prayer of consent.
Yes.
So that, in a certain sense,
so as consent becomes more complete, it's more surrender. And you could call it, just say, surrendering to love if you prefer. I find love too confining a word because it has so many different meanings in the English language. But still, it's a good word to use.
As a founding member of Contemplative Outreach, how has your involvement with Contemplative Outreach helped you in your spiritual journey, or in your mission, or in your desire to respond to the Spirit?
Well, I suppose like any active ministry or purposeful and at least in intention, well worked out set of teachings, it's been thoroughly exhausting and inspiring at times, and has certainly sort of pulled out of me whatever talents I have in expressing the spiritual journey in words that are somewhat intelligible. But I regard the actual results of centering prayer to be completely the work of the Holy Spirit that can't be predicted. Sometimes the most unlikely people seem to connect, and others who are well-trained don't seem to quite get it, that they're always thinking and they can't quite let go of their thoughts. But that's partially their way they were educated and partially temperamental. But I think grace tries to overcome that, and of course the great trump card that God has is the process of dying. If He can't persuade you to let go during life, you have to let go when nature says, this is the end of you, pal. And so death is the greatest friend there is.
So your 30 years with Contemplative Outreach, in a certain sense, the Spirit used it to intensify your talents and have them articulated in a way far beyond your wildest imaginings, I would say.
Yes, no, the effort to share it required of me a good deal of research, a lot of thinking, a lot of experimentation in how to express it, and in books that would follow up the teaching, so I wouldn't forget it if nobody else read it. So, that's true. So we didn't really have the book that described how to do it until '86. I think '86 at least.
Yes.
And so I saw how much ignorance people had, no training whatsoever in the mystical tradition. So I wrote books that were, very simple as far as information went, just to bring people up to the same page so that they could begin. And this, I think, is the one of the, to anticipate one of your questions there, is the great contribution, and in fact the essential contribution, without which the centering prayer movement would not have continued this far, which is a simple structure to provide ongoing renewal of the original experience through workshops, books, tapes, and especially retreats.
Retreats, yes.
That if people continue doing, they continue to grow. As certainly we've experienced here in our particular retreat situation, as some of the same people come back year after year, and listening to them and what they've got out of it in the sort of sharing that takes place at the end. It's awesome what graces they have received when they thought they were getting nothing for years, because breakthroughs don't usually occur, or if they do, you forget them if they happen too soon, or you don't have a repetitive situation where you can easily renew the circumstances that brought about the breakthrough.
Well, Contemplative Outreach now celebrating its 30th anniversary. What would you like to say to the community that you're part of as they're celebrating their 30th anniversary?
Well, I can only say what the elders in monasteries have always said, which is persevere, meaning keep doing it, rain or shine. And if you're, since meditation is not only pleasant, but also purifying, don't be surprised by the ups and downs of our subjective experience, and just accept what happens. This is when you actually consent, you're giving away any control whatsoever over the results of what you're doing. So it's allowing that consent to be purified by the Spirit, who will send us inwardly and outwardly the external people or teaching or books or trials that we need. And hence that bottom line to that teaching is to place all our trust in God and in His love and in His determination to bring this about.
People have asked, about what might be your attitude towards how the world is unfolding, and what do you see as the contribution that Contemplative Outreach is going to make, or the practice of contemplative prayer is going to make to the world in general as it unfolds and evolves?
Well, I don't feel a responsibility for that.
Oh, I know that.
This is God's problem. I mean, I'm trying to...
And we're both part of it.
To humbly do what I'm doing, realizing how inadequate it is. I think the problems in society are enormous. One reason is the population is increasing. So there's more energy, good or bad, circulating around the planet. So the blindness of so many things simply repeats the weakness of human nature, so you wonder whether we're in a regressive period of evolution or whether this is the necessary cutting edge of a breakthrough in consciousness. I really don't know. So my trust is, I'm afraid, not in humans.
Thank goodness.
Still less in horses and chariots, to quote the Psalms, but it's in God's goodness and in the plan that of evolutionary transformation that may take a millennia, for all I know. And all I can hope to do, and hope that Contemplative Outreach can do, is to make a contribution to the change of consciousness, whatever is required, that will lead to its more general acceptance throughout the human family as it continues to evolve.
General acceptance of what, Thomas?
Of God and the contemplative journey and the values that transformation introduces into people's attitudes and thinkings, especially the desire for peace, the willingness to forgive, compassion, attentive to the needs of those that really need help. Without a certain amount of basic human needs being fulfilled, it's very hard to pursue a spiritual journey because you're preoccupied with where you're going to eat or sleep or how you're going to escape the disasters or the guns or the bombs. It's, in other words, in some ways, the environment is getting more difficult as it becomes more technological because of weapons of destruction, and communication are getting more and more effective, leaving human values to shift where they may.